Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. After a decade of wars and an ongoing global financial crisis, particularly in the Eurozone, just how attractive is the West when it comes to soft power? Is the West, specifically the U.S., losing its ability to influence others through example and the power of ideas and values? CrossTalk Soft Power, I'm joined by Craig Hayden in Washington. He's an assistant professor in the International Communications Program at American University School of International Service. Also in Washington, we have Ivan Elan. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. And in London, we cross to Jonathan McClory. He is a strategy advisor at Win Creative. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Ivan Elan, if I can go to you first in Washington, what is the state of America's soft power today? Okay? A lot of people think the U.S. took a real battering under the Bush years, and now we've had 4 years of Obama. What is America's brand value?
Well, I think America has a lot of brand value, but I don't think it comes from funding democratic forces in other countries. I mean, I don't think this works very well. Since 1900, we've tried to impose democracy using military power 15 times, and 11 times it's failed. 2 times it's still out, and 4 times it's succeeded. So it doesn't have a very success rate, even when you force it on people. So I think letting it bubble up from the bottom is better than funding democratic groups in elections and funding even process things to bring about democracy. I think people have to do it themselves in whatever country it is, and I don't think we have the money for it here in the United States anymore to do these types of things.
Okay, Craig, what do you think about that? I mean, you know, Ivan brings up a good point. I mean, it's kind of difficult for the United States to talk about democracy when it's using drones and it has Gitmo and there's an assault on civil liberties at home.
Yeah, I think that soft power is a lot about credibility and legitimacy, and I think that when international actors, whether it's the United States or China, engage in these kinds of activities, I think it hurts their soft power. But that doesn't mean that the United States does not have soft power or the capacity to leverage some of its political values or its foreign policy to achieve some sort of foreign policy objective. I think it's a not so clear-cut a picture for the United States and its soft power.
Well, if I could stay with you, could you give me an example where positive soft power, where you get a positive outcome when looking at U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I mean, one of the things that people have talked about is whether or not the events in the Middle East represent a victory for soft power, such as the Arab Spring. And on the one hand, right, you can look to this as an example of democracy as a political value succeeding, or at least starting to succeed in the region. On the other hand, right, it's not necessarily the case that this is a quote-unquote victory for American soft power. America doesn't own the institution of democracy. It's not uniquely American. But on the same token, right, it's important to recognize that soft power isn't necessarily about the actor itself, right? The United States may want to get democracies in certain parts of the world, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the world has to like the United States. And I think that there's a clear distinction. Soft power is not necessarily a popularity contest.
What do you think about that, John? And that's very interesting there. I mean, but the United States tends to promote democracy for geopolitical reasons, not because democracy is a good idea.
Yeah, well, Peter, I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet, actually, is the cultural aspects of soft power. We've talked about democratic political values. We've talked about U.S. foreign policy, which can oftentimes be running counter to thinking on soft power. But really, in terms of cultural output and cultural outreach, the U.S. is second to none in the world. And its ability to attract different people. If we think about it, the U.S. has about 660,000 foreign students studying in American universities. That's more than any other country. So their ability to attract through culture, through universities, through civil society is really unrivaled. And we do run into some problems, obviously, with American foreign policy, but I think it's important to recognize the strength of cultural American soft power.
You know, Jonathan, we just did a program on the Egyptian presidential election, and to go to further what you were saying here, I could well imagine an Egyptian sitting in Pizza Hut in Cairo saying, you know, they're going to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood because they were perceived as being more nationalistic against Israel, against the United States. I mean, what I'm saying is you can sit in Pizza Hut and enjoy an American pizza, but it doesn't make you like foreign policy coming out of Washington.
No, I think that's very true. And I think people can compartmentalize and pick and choose what they like. But I don't think that it's you know, a stated American aim, you know, to undermine the Muslim Brotherhood's election. I think the Americans are just happy to see an election happening.
Okay, well, that could be debated here. Ivan, what do you think about that? Because, I mean, the application of American soft power tends to backfire on it because the middle of the Arab Spring was just brought up here. I would say the Arab Spring came about despite American foreign policy. I don't think the United States had anything to do with promoting democracy in that region.
Well, I think you have a valid point, because I think the Muslim Brotherhood is not necessarily very open to U.S. ideas, and some of the other groups that have taken power as well. We don't know what's going to happen in a lot of these countries when we do, you know, throw the dictator off like Libya, or if Syria goes, what are we going to get there? We don't know what we're going to get in Egypt. We talk about soft power. I mean, the Egyptian government arrested some of the groups that were promoting democracy, foreign groups. So you can see how well-liked they are in countries, if that's an example. The other thing I think we need to distinguish is between, when we say power, we mean government power. Well, I agree that the U.S. gets a lot of tourists and a lot of students, but that has nothing to do with our government, or very little to do with it. It has to do with the attractiveness of our society. And when you talk about soft power, I think you're talking about government, funding of democracy, foreign aid, that sort of thing. And I don't really think it's very effective overseas. And even in countries like Germany, where they developed the East, they haven't been very successful at it. They waste a lot of money on stuff, and I think we waste a lot of money on a lot of these programs, not only aid programs, but democracy promotion programs that really don't work, and as you say, have a counterproductive effect, because people think that we're meddling in their affairs rather than promoting democracy.
Okay, Greg, if I can go to you, I mean, Bahrain comes up here, and you mentioned the word credibility. And again, you know, when we look at the changes in the Arab Spring, what kind of credibility does the United States have when it continues to turn a blind eye to the atrocities in Bahrain? And, you know, what they want is what anyone else wants, is like in Egypt or Tunisia. I mean, the brand of American democracy is undermined when you have hypocrisy like that.
Yeah, and I think you highlight, you know, one of the tensions in soft power, right? In an era of global media transparency, when international actors can monitor what you do, those kinds of actions, which I think are at cross purposes with other efforts to promote soft power, really undermine efforts of soft power. But I don't think this is actually unique to the United States. And I think this also highlights a problem with soft power as a tool of statecraft. You know, we've talked about today about this, the idea of using soft power to promote the society, to promote culture, right? But it doesn't necessarily, it's not really that useful very often in short-term kinds of exercises, and in terms of achieving a specific foreign policy outcome on a very short timetable. Exchange programs, long-term public diplomacy, the promotion of society through pop culture, these all have, I think, positive outcomes in the long term, but they're also undermined when, and again, in an era of heightened media visibility, the United States, for example, makes a decision in Bahrain that seems at cross purposes with the kind of moral and ethical message that it's trying to promote with its other public diplomacy and soft power related programs. So I take your point, right, that soft power may not necessarily be always available to the United States, and also that it can be easily undermined. It's not something that is durable. It has to be sustained, and it has to be sustained in part because the world is always watching.
Okay, Jonathan, can you give me an example?
Just to jump in.
Go ahead, Joe. Go ahead, jump in.
Just to jump in, I really agree with Craig there, and I think it's important to bring up and distinguish what kinds of objectives and goals countries are trying to achieve. Soft power is not suited to sort of unilateral goals, or really even at times specific goals, but it is well suited to multilateral goals, dealing with issues like climate change, dealing with issues of world health, of disease outbreak, essentially problems that are multilateral and complex in nature that require really networks, and sometimes networks that expand beyond just governments, but go into the private sector, go into NGOs, go into multilateral organizations. That's where soft power is really going to help. And I don't think it's worth even debating soft power as a sort of silver bullet for foreign policy, because it's definitely not. It's one tool in the toolbox of foreign policy.
Yeah, but Jonathan, do you really need soft power for the issues that you were mentioning? I mean, people are for good health, okay? We may have differences about what's going on with the climate, but what does soft power have to do with that? I mean, there are problems to be solved, okay? Well, it's not ideological,
actually,
really.
I think,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, well, I think there's one of the best examples, I think, of soft power in action was the Ottawa process to ban landmines. And while they haven't brought everybody around to it, you know, you had Canada, you had a host of other countries, you had multilateral organizations, you had Princess Diana involved as well. And eventually they wound up, you know, getting concessions out of the Pentagon, whereas I realize the U.S. isn't a total signatory and they haven't ratified exactly, but they're more or less in compliant. And again, China and Russia as well, and I think 31 other countries didn't sign, but you still really had the creation of a new norm. And I think it was effective use of soft power. So that is an example of how you can use issue framing and norms and effectively soft power to achieve multilateral goals.
Absolutely, and
go ahead,
if I
Craig,
could also
jump
add,
in.
I think that, I think what we're highlighting here is the fact that soft power isn't easily used to justify an outcome, right? You can't easily say to perhaps, you know, your boss in the Foreign Service, look, I just use soft power to achieve that outcome. Oftentimes, the imprint of power isn't so obvious. And I think this highlights the analytical difficulties with soft power. How do we know it when we see it?
All right, I want to go back to that point. We're going to go
implicated?
to a short break, and after a short break, we'll continue our discussion on soft power. Stay with RT. Okay, Craig, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. Who cares about soft power? My goodness, if you have hard power, you're going to get what you want. So who really cares? I mean, it's an academic exercise. You know, I've studied soft power for a long time, and I think it's an interesting concept. But, you know, if you're strong, you get what you want. And it doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks. Go ahead.
You know, I've heard this argument before. I've heard people say that soft power is really a luxury of people in power. But whether or not we can accurately define soft power as this and not that, or analytically distinguish it, I think what's important is that international actors, whether they be nation states or NGOs, recognize soft power as important. So we need to pay attention to it. And I think the clearest example of this is the incredible investment in soft power by China. Right? Whether or not soft power works, they believe it works.
But do you think
so
it works?
But
do you think it works? Do you think the world has changed its opinion about China after all of that investment? Do you think it's effective?
Well, like I said earlier, I think soft power is a long-term game. I don't think that it is evidence in the short term in ways that are obvious. I think that the long game of soft power is to change the rules of the game for international relations so that other nation states and actors play by your rules, or value what you value, or populations that are crucial to your foreign policy will at the very least tolerate what you want to do. And so it's not easy to just wave a magic wand, you know, with soft power on it and say, look, you know, look, soft power just worked. But institutionally and in the long term, I think it does.
Okay, Ivan, if I can go to you. I was in Kabul recently, and, you know, that's all I saw was hard power, okay? The Afghans don't want us there. We want to get out, and there's a lot of people with NGOs, et cetera, making a fortune, you know, living in their barracks, okay? All I saw was soft power there. After a decade of war, there's been no impact on the Afghan people that I could see.
Well, I think they're making them dependent. Their entire economy is dependent on aid and that sort of thing. And when we take that out, they're going to be more dependent on the opium more than ever. And I think this leads to a more general problem of dependency. And are we really helping countries by doing these sorts of things? And also, how do we define soft power. What is this amorphous influence that we get? I think it is just a playground of the foreign policy elite. The average taxpayer, if you told them, well, we're not really sure what this is, and we're not really sure whether it's going to be effective, and we don't really know what kind of influence, in quotes, we're going to get out of this, they would go, well, then why am I paying for it? But that's not the equation in Washington, where we spend other people's money. And I think we need to have, if we're going to do these programs or whatever, whether it's democracy promotion, foreign aid, we need to have a better idea of whether they're actually effective. And I think many foreign aid programs have been quite the opposite, because it leads to dependency on the foreign aid. And I think really it inhibits countries from making economic reforms that would include vast amounts of private investment if they deregulated their markets and everything. Private investment always dwarfs foreign aid when you get it going, but the countries are not going to get it going because the foreign aid either goes into the regime's pocket or whatever. And I think a lot of this democracy promotion, we don't really see much for it, and I think we need a better evaluation structure for some of these programs to see whether they're effective. I think we're just pouring money down the drain. We certainly did it in Iraq, and I think your point is excellent in Afghanistan. It's the same thing.
Okay. Jonathan, is soft power the luxury of those that have hard power? Because it seems to me it's it's kind of like, it's putting a bikini on a pig, but it's still a pig. You're still going to go out and conquer people, invade countries, and you're going to justify it, and you're going to have all those wonderful pictures from CNN about babies being killed and all this, even though, BBC carries pictures from the wrong war when it is describing Syria. I mean, it's just a luxury for those that have hard power to clean up and maybe hide their mess.
I think, Peter, it's an easy target, probably because it started as an academic concept. So there are plenty of critics who want to call it, as a result, an academic exercise. But really, I think the world is changing. I know that sounds incredibly cliche, but it's true, especially when we think about the diffusion of power. So power is moving not only from west to east, but it's also moving away from states altogether. And this means just purely trying to use hard power is more difficult. And in fact, I suppose some of the US's use of hard power recently shows the limitations of that. And I think as you try to get your way, as countries try and achieve objectives, soft power is going to be more important. And I haven't even touched on the issue of power diffusion, but also if we think about advancements in telecommunications and how fast information moves around, and the democratization of access to that information really empowers more people. And this means people have a better understanding of what's happening.
Okay, but Jonathan, it's a good point. If I can go to Craig, then what's the difference between soft power and just good spin plus technology?
I think, well, one of the distinctions that Joseph Nye, the author of Soft Power, makes is that soft power is not about propaganda. It's all about establishing legitimacy and credibility, and that I think the concept relies upon the global audience to recognize what is propaganda and what isn't. I think, though, that as we wrestle with this notion of soft power as whether it's just an academic exercise or something that is antiquated now in this highly transparent media environment, I think we may need to amend the concept of soft power before we throw it out. So yes, it may be difficult to say that the United States soft power isn't working in country X or country Y. That doesn't mean that it isn't important, and it doesn't mean that we aren't doing something that has some kind of soft power dimension. I'd like to point to the idea of collaborative power, which Anne-Marie Slaughter, the former director of policy planning at the State Department, has talked about, which is really looking at the ways in which international actors, both NGOs and states, are working together to solve global problems, whether it's on the environment, whether it's on human rights issues or other things like that, that really might be the final frontier of soft power, right? Where it's not just country A having soft power, but it's a variety of international actors seizing power to solve issues.
Okay, then if we're going to go down that path there, Ivan, why don't we just believe in the United Nations Security Council and its resolutions? Again, if collaborative power, it's always, who's going to determine what the outcome, the foreign policy outcome that people want to have? We could look at Syria right here. How can that be collaborative if you have so many different vested interests and geopolitical interests in looking at a country like that?
Well, I think you're exactly right. Usually collaborative power in the international community are those of the nations with hard power who can drive the agenda and also who have the most money to spend on soft power, I guess. But I distinguish between soft power and private individuals doing things overseas, fighting AIDS, etc. I think that's very valid, a very useful thing. But I think when we get when governments do it, they don't do it for humanitarian reasons. They usually do it to look good, to burnish their image. There's always some geopolitical thing they're trying to achieve, even if it's an amorphous type of goal, which it usually is. And I think that it is all spin most of the time when governments do it. Governments aren't intrinsically altruistic as people and organizations are, private organizations. I think there's usually some ulterior motive, and not just by the U.S. government, by many other governments as well when they do these things.
Craig, what do you think about that?
I think that I don't think it's necessarily right to indict nation states for wanting to serve their constituency and serve their people and to, get at their geostrategic goals. What this reminds me of is a debate that started, I think, a few years ago with Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, James Glassman, under the Bush administration, forwarded this notion of public diplomacy 2.0 as a way to think about how the U.S. projects its image abroad. And what he was really saying was the business of the State Department is not so much to burnish the image of the United States, but to provide means of communication, exchange, and engagement in populations that are important to U.S. foreign policy interests. Right? So rather than saying, you need to like the United States, look how great we are, we're demonstrating our influence, the United States' influence, by giving forum for debate, by empowering people in developing regions. We can look to this now in the so-called notion 21st century statecraft. Some of you may be familiar with the technology advisor Alec Ross, who talks about how the State Department is now connecting technology developers with civil society actors around the world in order to solve global problems. This doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on the image of the United States, but it does, I think, impact the environment that the United States wants to and needs to act in other aspects of its foreign policy. And I think this represents a change in the purpose of foreign policy, really, and how we should understand soft power.
Jonathan, what do you think about soft power in the 21st century in light of what Craig just said there? I mean, it was interesting, this all happened under George W. Bush. I mean, I can't imagine how any other country's foreign policy and image could be as disastrous as that. So it was the Bush administration that was thinking about these things.
Yeah, well, the irony is a lot of the soft power instruments of the U.S., at the disposal of the U.S., were cut under Clinton. And then, so straight away, the U.S.'s capacity to engage, get out a message was hindered under Bush. And then, obviously, the Iraq War wasn't terribly popular. And so, yeah, the U.S.'s image took a beating under the Bush administration. But I think a lot of the damage was undone simply through perceptions when Obama was elected. It had a huge effect. If you look at, there's the GFK Anhalt Nation Brand Index. Between 2008 and 2009, the U.S. moved from 7th in the world in terms of global perceptions to 1st in the world. So it had a huge impact.
Okay, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Much more to discuss. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.